happy little games. Hello my friends, and welcome back to Volume 4 of the Arcade Conversions. Over my many number of years as a video gamer, I have seen my fair share of good arcade conversions, and I've also seen some that were positively putrid. As a 9-year-old peckerwood running around the arcades back in 1980, I was always fascinated with the latest and greatest arcade games, and even more curious as to what they would look like running on my humble Atari 2600. Skip ahead 40 years and I'm still enjoying the various conversions of these arcade classics. I have gone through my vast library of mini documentaries and picked out some of the best and the worst that have ever been released. I did go back and re-record the audio in certain cases because my original microphone sounded like I was talking into a tin can with a string attached to it. So if you've already seen all of my videos, and seriously, thank you so much if you have, then you might want to take a pass on this. However, I did go back and add new jokes and other extras, so this just might be worth your while. Make sure you have your gas relief handy because there are farts and queefs aplenty all throughout this video. So if you'd like, sit back, take your shoes off, and enjoy the presentation. These are the Arcade Conversions Volume 4. The Spectrum port is up next, and while it is colorful, it doesn't look or quite feel like Smash TV. The graphics have been zoomed in and everything has a weird quality to it. The animation is smooth, but it doesn't feel like the arcade game. It feels more like a low-budget Spectrum game. It does play reasonably well, even with only one fire button. If a developer such as the Sales Curve had taken over, perhaps this version would have turned out a whole lot better. Plus, it is a bit on the short side. The Amstrad version looks pretty good. In fact, it looks a whole lot better than the Spectrum port. The sprites are small but detailed, and the speed is pretty close to the arcade original. The game does have a couple problems though, and the first one is the choppy animation. The sound effects are only adequate and there is absolutely no music. It does control pretty good, even though it's only using one fire button. The good old Commodore 64 version is up next, and it turned out pretty well. There aren't as many enemies on screen as found in the arcade game, but that just makes it a whole lot easier. Another standout from this version is the ability to use two joysticks to replicate the controls from the arcade game. The graphics are nicely detailed and the animation is fairly smooth. The speed is also very close to the arcade game. Up next is the Master System version, and honestly, it's not very good. The graphics and animation are bland and have a bit of a washed out look to them. When there is a lot of action on screen, it will slow down and get very choppy. Once again, you only have one fire button, so you have to make do with firing in only one direction. At least the speed is close to the arcade game. As you can see from the clips, the Game Gear version turned out very similar to the Master System version. The NES version is my favorite of all the 8-bit ports. It featured not only great playability, but also a lot of the bells and whistles found in the arcade game. Right out of the gate, I have to mention that you can use both NES controllers to replicate the arcade game. This puts the playability through the roof and head and shoulders above all other conversions except for the Super Nintendo. You even get a fair amount of digitized speech, which is something of a rarity on the NES unit. While not as many enemies on screen, it's still a good representation on 8-bit hardware. Something else I should mention is that there is no slowdown or flicker anywhere in sight. One question I've always had from the very first time I played this is, what the heck is Liberace doing in this game? The Amiga version is pretty good, but once again you have to contend with only one fire button. However, this does allow you to use 2 joysticks, but with a sacrifice in the 2-player option. The speed of the game, which is essential to a true Smash TV conversion, is very close to the arcade game. The graphics and animation are well done and for the most part very smooth. There is even some of the digitized speech retained from the arcade game. The Sega Genesis version tries its best, but it's inferior to the Super Nintendo port in almost every way. First off, you can hook up 2 controllers to get that arcade feel. However, you do lose the 2-player aspect of the game. There's a big loss of color when compared to the Super Nintendo version, and the digitized samples are very scratchy. The music, however, is very good, as is the speed. The Atari ST port is very similar to the Amiga version, although running a little bit slower. The music is not as good and there are no digitized samples to be found. Due to it running a bit slower, it is easier than the Amiga version. Now let's get to the creme de la creme, the Super Nintendo version. This is a very close representation of the arcade game. This is the only one that comes close to replicating the arcade game thanks to the Super Nintendo's controls. This was renamed Super Smash TV because everything on the Super Nintendo had to be super. The graphics and animation are very detailed and the animation is extremely smooth. All of the voice samples seems to have made it over from the arcade and the music is pretty good as well. Before we start sniffing its farts, there are a couple of things. The first one is the censorship. When you step on a landmine, the eyeballs don't explode and there's no blood. The sample quality of the voices is not very good either. However, these are just minor things and don't really affect the gameplay at all. Let's get this party started with the Spectrum version. Is this a Spider-Man game or Stun Runner? Because it sure doesn't look like Stun Runner. The tunnel effects are laughable, featuring shifting cycles of psychedelic circles. To be fair, the animation is fairly smooth and the game is fairly fast. It's just not Stun Runner. Let's get this party started with the Spectrum version. Is this a Spider-Man game or Stun Runner? Because it sure doesn't look like Stun Runner. The tunnel effects are laughable, featuring shifting cycles of psychedelic circles. To be fair, the animation is fairly smooth and the game is fairly fast. It's just not Stun Runner. There doesn't appear to be any music and the sound effects are laughable at best. They're not quite chock full of queefy goodness, but they do grate on your nerves after a while. If the game were released under an original title, perhaps it may have fared better. The Amstrad version looks a little bit better than the Spectrum, but it does have some weird effects going on when you are in the tunnel. It looks like your destination is a giant bleached butthole as you bob from left to right. The tracks outside the tunnel are too slow and choppy. At least the graphics are colorful. Surprisingly, the sound effects are actually pretty good. Even released under an original title though, the game would still smell like pee. And then we have the Commodore 64 version. Oh my. Just when you thought the conversions couldn't get any worse, we have this pile of tripe. Did you love the arcade game but wish everything was blockier and slower and crappier? Then this is the game for you. The stars in the course have been replaced by giant red blocks. The nice, smooth, circular tunnel entrances have also been replaced by giant squares. Once you get inside the tunnel, the animation is fairly smooth though. The awesome SID chip has been wasted because the sound is really annoying, especially when going over the blocks or stars or whatever the heck they are. The Atari ST version is up next, and believe it or not, this is a 16-bit version. This looks like an unfinished mess with horrible colors and horrible designs. If you thought the 8-bit versions were slow and choppy, then this one takes the cake. The game runs at 3 or 4 frames per second inside the tunnel, which is just unacceptable. Similar to the Commodore 64 version, the sound it makes when going over the stars grates on your nerves. I'd rather listen to my wife for 3 hours than listen to this, and that's saying something. Would I recommend this game? Absolutely not. Next up is the Amiga version, which is very similar to the Atari ST. The speed inside the tunnel is a little bit better, running at 5 frames per second instead of 4. The sound is also much better with digitized voices and sound effects. I was first made aware of this game coming out for my Amiga from a European magazine. Since I was a naive hick from the sticks, I went ahead and ordered it without reading any reviews. Talk about a letdown. Not only is the game slow and not very fun to play, the original release also had a bug that would not let you get past the first level. The MS-DOS version is up next, and honestly, it's not bad. Looking very similar to the other 16-bit versions with only one difference. This one is fast and fairly smooth. The animation both inside and outside the tunnels look really good. Unfortunately, it's only in EGA mode, so the colors are a bit drab. There is no Sound Blaster support, so it's Queefaroo just for you. This is as close as you're going to get on a 16-bit computer back in 1990. And now we come to the only reason I ever bought an Atari Lynx handheld. S.T.U.N Runner is a masterpiece for this miniature 16-bit device. Who would have thought that the best conversion of S.T.U.N Runner would be on a handheld? This version is exactly what we should have had on the 16-bit computers. Nice, smooth animation, and the speed is really fast. Every piece of digitized sound and speech was included from the arcade game. Unlike every other version, this one feels like S.T.U.N Runner when you play it, and that's what it's all about. Now sure, when you play this on an emulator using full screen, the graphics are blocky, but shrink that puppy down to Atari Lynx size and it's very impressive. Check it out on the handy emulator if you want to experience it yourself.
The outside wall is back.
The game was also released as part of Midway's Arcade Treasures 3 compilation for the Xbox, PlayStation 2, and GameCube. Unfortunately, their method of emulation was not up to snuff because the frame rate is too choppy and there are bugs all throughout the game. For ease of use, I guess it's okay to play, but if you want something arcade perfect, stick with MAME. The first version we are looking at is the Spectrum. First off, the bad. This game is devoid of hardly any color. If you like the colors of your game to be of the urine flavor, then piss is the game for you. The sprites are large and detailed and are decently animated. The backgrounds are nice and detailed and vary quite a bit from stage to stage. The speed of the game is pretty good, even with a lot of enemies on screen. Out of all the 8-bit ports, this version fills up the screen with the most enemies. Aside from a few clicks whenever you make contact with an enemy, this version has absolutely no sound. All of the home computer ports only use one fire button, so sacrifices had to be made. The good old Commodore 64 version is up next and is not bad for an 8-bit machine. Rather than try to straight up adapt the sprites from the arcade game, they retooled them for the 64 and they look pretty good. The colors are a bit iffy, especially when compared to the 8-bit Amstrad port. The backgrounds are well drawn with plenty of detail and animation in certain spots. Gameplay is fairly smooth, but unfortunately there's no more than 3 enemies on screen at once. This takes away the frenetic gameplay and urgency from the arcade version. We do get music while we play, which is always a big plus. The Amstrad version is up next, and what a port it is. For an 8-bit machine, this really does a convincing job of replicating the bells and whistles of its 16-bit big brother. The sprites are large and detailed with a nice lush color palette. Even the scrolling, which is something the Amstrad sometimes has trouble with, has been replicated fairly well. There are no more than 4 enemies on screen at once, so the pace isn't quite as hectic as the arcade original. There is absolutely no music and minimal sound effects. The controls are fairly responsive, and even with only one fire button, it's a good representation of the arcade original. Up next is the most widely seen port, and that would be the NES version. This was done in-house by Konami, and they did a really good job. The sprites are fairly detailed, but they are lacking a bit of color. Also, they should be called Teenage Mutant Anorexic Turtles because all 4 characters are looking a bit on the thin side. The sound effects and music are excellent and really capture the feel of the arcade game. All of the cutscenes and the introduction were brought over and they look great. The only downside is there are no voice samples in the game. However, you get more Pizza Hut product placement than you can shake a stick at. The gameplay is great and feels just like the arcade game. Due to the arcade game being so short, Konami added 2 extra levels for this release. The first of the 16-bit computer ports is the MS-DOS version. At least graphically, this turned out pretty well. Unfortunately, when it starts to move, it all goes downhill. The sprites are missing many frames of animation, so everything comes across as a choppy mess. The backgrounds are nice and detailed, and the colors are vibrant though, with large detailed sprites. When you actually play the game, the hit detection is a bit off, but not quite as bad as found in other versions. Minimalistic sound effects are what's on tap, but you do get a nice rendition of the music while you play. Up next is the Amiga version, and unfortunately, this is the worst 16-bit port. While the graphics and animation are on par with the MS-DOS version, the playability is not. The collision detection is even worse here than the previous versions. Something else you'll notice after starting to play is there's absolutely no music. You do get some small sound effects, but that's it. This version could have been so much more. And finally, we have the Atari ST version. This improves the jittery scrolling found in the DOS and Amiga versions, but really that's about it. The graphics and animation are very similar to the DOS port except for the music. There are actually 3 or 4 tracks that play as opposed to 1. The controls feel a little bit better in this version as opposed to the Amiga. In 1999, it was released as a part of Konami's arcade classics on the PlayStation 1. In 2002, Konami Collector's Series Arcade Advance was released for the Game Boy Advance and featured Time Pilot, along with 5 other classic arcade games. This one is notable because it includes an extra 6th area not found in the arcade game, which is 1 million BC, and instead of shooting planes, you have to shoot down pterodactyls. To access this, you have to enter the Konami code. The game was released on Xbox Live in 2006. The Nintendo DS received Konami Classic Series arcade hits, which included a whopping 15 games on one cartridge with Time Pilot among them. A newer version was released on Xbox Live by Digital Eclipse and featured updated graphics as an option. It's amazing what a fresh coat of paint will do.
Now playing on ColecoVision, Mr. Do and Time Pilot, two of the best new arcade games for the best system made. This is Time Pilot, a battle with aircraft from the past and the future.
Homing missile! Got him! Uh-oh, blue bomber!
And this is Mr. Do. Mow a path to his fruit and start picking, but don't get picked off.
Powerball!
Nice shot. Mr. Do and Time Pilot, now playing on ColecoVision. The best system in town keeps getting better.
The first one we are looking at is the trusty, but perhaps rusty, Atari 2600 version. This is about as bare bones as you can get when it comes to Time Pilot. As a matter of fact, the last time I saw something this plain, I married it. The graphics are reminiscent of the arcade game, but the animation and scrolling has quite a bit of herky-jerky action going on. The colors are very muted and are a bit distracting when playing. There is no music, but as far as the sound effects go, farts and queefs, anybody? Whoever thought that this sounded even remotely decent should have been taken around back and beaten with a wooden stick. The controls are sluggish and not very responsive, although all 5 levels are here. Now let's take a look at the ColecoVision version, and it's a big step up from the 2600 port. The graphics are more on point with the arcade game, with the colors especially looking very good. The sprites are fairly detailed and the animation is much better in this version, however, the speed of the game is not. When there is a lot of action on the screen, everything slows down and the scrolling gets extremely choppy. The sound effects and music are good, with the opening tune easily recognizable as the arcade original. The game does include the parachuting soldiers, but it does omit the UFO stage. Control-wise, it plays great, it's just too bad the scrolling wasn't just a little bit smoother. Now here is a nice surprise. The MSX version is very well done and looks to be programmed by Konami themselves. Although graphically it does look similar to the ColecoVision version, the scrolling is a little bit smoother and so is the animation. The sprites are detailed and the speed of the game is fairly close to the arcade game. Sound effects and music are good and definitely do not grate on your nerves like the 2600 port. Everything from the arcade game has been included, from the parachuting soldiers to the enemy attack formations. Finally, it also includes the UFO level, which was sorely missing from the ColecoVision version. The playability is great and it feels like you are playing the actual arcade game. The X68000 version is a bit of an oddity in my opinion. When I booted this game up for the first time and after playing it for 15 seconds, I had to check and make sure I didn't do any crack beforehand because the speed of the game is insanely fast. While the graphics are nicely detailed and the animation is smooth, they are not quite exactly arcade perfect and more of a loose translation. The sound effects and music are good and the controls are very responsive. Everything from the arcade game is here, including all 5 levels. It's a pretty good conversion, but the system is capable of so much more. rather excellent clone was released for the Commodore 64 back in 1986 called Space Pilot. This was designed by the same German programmer who gave us the horrendous Galaga clone on the same system. How this was never pursued by the legal team at Konami is beyond me. This is a very close conversion to the arcade original, including the sprites along with the music and sound effects. The only thing that is lacking is that the backgrounds do not change colors when switching time periods. Other than that, everything from the arcade game has been included. It plays great and feels like an official conversion of the arcade game. A fantastic homebrew version was released for the Vectrex system called Vector Pilot. For those of you who don't know, and since this is the first time I have ever covered a Vectrex game, the unit was released back in 1982 and featured an integrated CRT monitor. Since everything was monochrome, games would include color overlays to be laid on top of the screen. There were also a few unique peripherals for the system, such as 3D capabilities, as well as a light pen. Vector Pilot is a fantastic conversion with smooth animation and scrolling with only a hint of slowdown, but only when there are a lot of enemies on screen. The sound effects and music are very close to the arcade game and the playability is spot on. The color overlays take a little bit of getting used to, but overall, this is a fantastic homebrew version of Time Pilot.
After these messages, we'll be right back.
Welcome to the club, Centipede. With Tommy P and his leg quartet. Come on down, come on down. Come on down, everybody.
We got more feet than you can count. We pick 'em up and we put 'em down. Come on down, come on down. We got those legs that are nice and hairy, but you can't choose 'cause we're too scary. Ow!
Atari presents Centipede. Come on down to the club.
The first one we are talking about that was one of the most popular was the Atari 2600 version. Despite the primitive hardware, this is a really good conversion even if your player looks like a flat piece of toast. The graphics are nothing to write home about, but they are adequate and get the job done. The sound effects are fantastic and sound really close to the arcade original. The thing that really shines though was the gameplay. Even with the joystick it feels like Centipede. Now, plug in the trackball accessory for the Atari 2600 and the controls are even better. This is a fantastic conversion and should be checked out if you haven't done so already. The Intellivision version is up next, and while we actually get mushrooms that look like mushrooms on the playfield, the animation is unfortunately extremely choppy. Now I know the Intellivision is capable of pulling off something closer to the arcade, but this really does hinder the gameplay. After playing for a while you sort of get used to it and it does become a bit more fun in my opinion. But overall, the playability of the 2600 version is leaps and bounds above this one. The Commodore VIC-20 port is really well done with fairly detailed sprites and fast gameplay. The controls are good and even better with the Atari trackball plugged in. The animation is fairly smooth and the sound effects and music are well done. This is an excellent cartridge release for Commodore's early computer. Sticking with the home computer line, the Texas Instruments version is up next. This is really good with large detailed sprites except for the Centipede, which is a bit on the small side. The animation is fairly smooth and it does feel like the arcade game. The gameplay is fantastic with nice tight controls. Another excellent official Centipede conversion. I was pleasantly surprised by how detailed the graphics were on the MS-DOS version. This looks very close to the arcade game and is the best one I've seen so far. Unfortunately, the choppy animation sort of ruins it in my opinion. You do get used to it the more you play, but what you don't get used to are the beloved farts and queefs that squeak out of the PC speaker. I don't know how PC owners back in the day dealt with this aside from putting on noise-canceling headphones. The gameplay is good though if you can just get used to the choppy animation. The ColecoVision port is rather fantastic despite some differences in the graphics. The animation, especially on the Centipede, is silky smooth and looks really good. The sound effects and music are nice and really remind you of the arcade game. Control-wise, it's nice and tight, but when you pull out the trackball accessory, it ups the playability at least 5 notches. It's another excellent arcade conversion that you have come to expect on the ColecoVision. The Atari 5200 version is even better than the ColecoVision when it comes to animation and gameplay. The animation in particular is silky smooth and really helps the overall feel of the game. The graphics are large and in charge with the Centipede looking great with large detailed segments. The sound effects and music are spot on and is a very close representation of the original. If you are lucky enough to have the trackball accessory, bust that thing out and enjoy a fantastic version that you can play at home. The good old Commodore 64 version is up next, and I have to say, compared to the 5200 and ColecoVision versions, this one is a bit of a letdown. The graphics are detailed, but the problem comes with the animation of the Centipede. It's just a bit too choppy in my opinion. The sound effects and music are decent, but the wonderful SID chip is capable of so much more. The star of the show is definitely the gameplay, even when playing with a joystick. Thanks to the Commodore computers using the same 9-pin joystick layout as the Atari line, you are able to use the trackball from that system on the 64, making it feel almost exactly like the arcade game. This was another early cartridge release for the system, and despite its flaws, it's still a good version. Now let's take a look at the abomination that is the Apple II version. First off, the mushrooms look like they just got out of preschool, but at least there are plenty of them on screen. The animation is extremely choppy, but the thing that really rears its ugly head is the sound. If you thought the farts and queefs of the MS-DOS version were bad, then be prepared for full-blown diarrhea from both the front and the back. Seriously, you have to mute this while playing because after 9.8 seconds you will want to gouge your eardrums out. On the bright side though, it doesn't play too bad. Considering how well the 5200 version turned out, you would expect something similar on the Atari 8-bit computer line. Unfortunately, that is just not the case. While the graphics are fairly large, they are only single color and lack any sort of detail. The animation is very choppy, especially when compared to the 5200. The sound effects and music are good, along with the gameplay, provided you can get used to the choppy animation. Another plus is the addition of the trackball, which really makes it feel like the arcade game. Let's stick with the Atari line and look at the 7800 version. Everything looks really good, from the mushrooms, to the spiders, to the silky smooth animation on the Centipede. The speed of the game is darn near identical to the arcade game, and it really shows when you are playing it. Sound effects and music are great, and the controls are good, but even better when you plug in a trackball. This was one of the original titles launched with the 7800 system, and it's another excellent conversion. The game was released as part of Arcade's Greatest Hits, the Atari collection on the Super Nintendo, Sega Saturn, and PlayStation. This compilation of games includes Asteroids, Battlezone, Missile Command, Super Breakout, Tempest, and Centipede. The Super Nintendo version shown here is rather good and is very close to being arcade perfect. The graphics are very detailed with the silky smooth animation. Sound effects and music are spot on along with the gameplay. Although there is no trackball support in any version, the PlayStation version does have support for the PlayStation mouse, which does help the gameplay quite a bit. There are some extras on the PlayStation and Sega Saturn versions, including interviews with the original developers of the games. If slow monochrome gaming is your thing, or you just happen to be colorblind, then the Game Boy version of Centipede is right up your alley. While the graphics are large and fairly detailed, the animation and speed is just way too slow and way too choppy. The sound effects are horrible, but not quite queef-worthy. The controls are adequate, but again, with animation this choppy, it makes it hard to enjoy the game. The game was released under the Arcade Classics title for the Game Gear. This is a compilation of 3 games including Centipede, Missile Command, and Ultra Pong. This is a rather ugly conversion, with the Centipede looking to be having a seizure as it's coming down the screen. Everything else looks decent, although a bit small when attempting to play on a real Game Gear unit. The gameplay is adequate, but not quite up to the standards of the original. The game was also released for the Sega Master System in Europe under the arcade smash hits, which included Centipede, Breakout, and Missile Command. Each of these included graphic and audio updates, which looks really nice. The animation is silky smooth and the controls are very responsive. This is much better than the Game Gear version, so check it out if you have a chance. We go from a pretty well received Sega Master System version to the lowest of lows, which is the Game Boy Color version. If you want your Centipede game to be a clunky, chunky, funky affair, then this is the one for you. The graphics are fairly detailed with nice rainbow mushrooms littering the playfield. The animation though is very choppy, making it extremely difficult to get used to. The game is also a bit on the slow side, making it one of the easiest versions I've played. If you are a Centipede weenie, be sure and check this one out. Shipping on a compilation cart that featured Breakout, Warlords, and Centipede is the Game Boy Advance version. This is another excellent handheld version that features nice detailed sprites with smooth animation. The colors are very vibrant and look really good when compared to the arcade game. The sound effects and music are very close to the arcade game and controls really well. Definitely great for a round of Centipede on the go. Let's get this party started with the Atari 2600 version. I had this game growing up for my Atari and I enjoyed it when I was a kid. A kid who apparently ate a lot of paint chips. Considering the hardware limitations, this isn't too bad of a representation of the arcade game with a few exceptions. The pickles and eggs look like gold and silver coins, and the hot dog that's chasing you looks like something I left in my toilet. And the bonus items you pick up look like something I've never seen before. The gameplay does feel like BurgerTime, and that's all that matters. Next up is the Aquarius version. For those of you who don't know, the Aquarius was a home computer released by Mattel in 1983. This wasn't a widely seen game, and honestly, it should have stayed that way. The graphic quality is not very good, and the animation looks like something out of Monty Python. The playability is horrible, but that could be due to the controller. This uses the same type of disc controller that the Intellivision uses, and I never liked them either. I seriously doubt you're going to download the Aquarius emulator and try this game out, but if you do, be warned. Did you know anybody that owned an Aquarius computer back in the day? Let me know down below. The Apple II version is up next, and despite the lack of colors, this is a really good version. The sprites are large and detailed, and the animation is nice and smooth. The gameplay is quick and responsive, and it feels like BurgerTime. There is even a decent rendition of the BurgerTime theme while you play. When compared to the Atari 2600 version, the Intellivision port is leaps and bounds above it. Everything looks the way it should. Sausages look like sausages, pickles look like pickles, and bonus items look like cups of coffee. The animation is nice and smooth, and the gameplay is very fast. Along with the music, this makes for a very good conversion of BurgerTime. Up next is the Texas Instruments version. This is a very good port for the system, with large detailed sprites and smooth animation. The gameplay speed is on par with the arcade original. We also get music and sound effects that are really good, making this another excellent conversion. The trusty but perhaps rusty Commodore 64 version is up next, but unfortunately it's only average at best. Everything has a sort of blandness to it, from the detail on the sprites to the animation. There is also a lack of in-game music. The gameplay is okay, but that goes with the rest of the entire presentation. Everything is just A-okay. The MS-DOS version looks really good for a 1982 game, despite the limited color palette. The graphics are nice and detailed with an excellent use of color. As far as sound goes, we have the dreaded PC speaker. Surprisingly, it sounds great. The gameplay is very similar to the arcade, which is exactly what we want. Another stellar conversion that was available is on the ColecoVision. First thing you notice is the excellent music and sound effects. The characters are very detailed and well animated, but there's lots of flicker going on. The playability is very good, and if it wasn't for the flicker, it would get an A+ in my book. In 1991, BurgerTime even got a release for the original Game Boy. This is a sort of a sequel or reboot with new levels and background graphics to make up for the lack of color. Everything looks good though, from the sprites to the animation. We even have some new tunes playing in the background. This was a really well done version. The game was also released for the original Famicom and Nintendo. First things first though, whoever thought it was a good idea to serve green meat needs to be slapped in the head. Actually though, everything else looks great. The sprites are large and detailed and are well animated. The playability, as you would expect, is very good. Well, there you have it, folks. The Arcade Conversions Volume 4. I hope you enjoyed this trip down memory lane. If you like these types of videos, please let me know in the comments down below. If you are interested in other retro items, be sure to check out my other channel, Patman QC History of Everything Retro. If you like this video, be sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Also, if you would like to support me on Patreon, please click the link below. Thank you everybody for watching.